Hamilton 3 years ago in the same room. This was just in the wake of the war in Yugoslavia. And as you recall, many people, including people in progressive organizations, supported that war. In part, I think it had to do with a lack of understanding, but again, we were caught up in what we thought was a humanitarian war to liberate the Kosovars from the dictatorship of Slobodan Milosevic. But I think when we look at the history of this entire period, starting in the early 90s, we understand that this is part of a war agenda, and there are several stages in this war agenda. Certainly Yugoslavia was one stage, and Yugoslavia was very important as a stepstone into the Afghan as well as into the Iraqi war for political, geopolitical, economic, strategic reasons. We know also that the Balkans is an important corridor for pipelines, for transportation. It is the gateway into the Middle East. But if you look at national security documents, you realize that all these wars are part of the same design. They're part of the same, they emanate from the same military doctrine. And this is now abundantly clear when we look at what is called the Project for the New American Century, which is this blueprint of global domination, which was published before the accession of Bush to the White House. It is essentially a blueprint. It identifies the stages of this war. If we look at national security documents going back to the Clinton administration, we have evidence that the war in Iraq was already planned. There's Central Command documents, which are part of military strategy, which say very explicitly, Iraq is first, then Iran, extending from the tip of Saudi Arabia up to the Caspian Sea basin. You have a region which encompasses approximately 70% of the world's supplies of oil and natural gas. Saudi Arabia, 26%, Iraq, 11% of total world reserves. That is 5 times those of the United States. And this ultimately is the objective of this war. It is to secure access, control, and ownership over these reserves. It's not the only objective, but it is certainly a key objective. And this region is strategic. And it's not only Iraq, it's the broader region. Now, if you look at this region, you'll notice that it is heavily militarized in the sense that each of these little planes indicates a U.S. military presence. Since the war in Yugoslavia, specifically 1999, with the outbreak of the air campaign, NATO signed an agreement with several former Soviet republics, which is called the GUAM: Georgia, Ukraine, Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, and Moldova. Explicitly, this military agreement was to protect and secure oil pipelines from the Caspian Sea basin back to Western markets. And in fact, very important to understand that these pipeline routes, they transit across the Caucasus, and then they also transit across the Balkans, which is also a pipeline project controlled by the same multinational companies. And there you can see that the civil war, which broke out in Macedonia in late 2001, was instigated actually by the CIA and by the U.S. military, always using Al-Qaeda as an instrument, as an intelligence asset to create conditions which ultimately lead to the destabilization of these countries. And one group of countries which is very important is Macedonia, Bulgaria, and Albania. And in the case of Macedonia, we know now for a fact that not only had you senior military advisors working with Islamic terrorists, which were integrated into the KLA. In other words, there was a direct collaboration between the U.S. military on the one hand and the Mujahideen, financed by Al-Qaeda, on the other. And it is amply documented that this collaboration took place. So we see that, and I'll try to go through several of the stages of this process. We see that on the one hand, the war is based on securing oil. It's based on securing control over people and institutions. It is also based, there's also a rivalry between the Anglo-American coalition on the one hand and what the U.S. media has called Old Europe, which is the alliance, essentially the alliance between France and Germany. And that confrontation is not in any way limited to the arena of diplomacy, to the Security Council of the United Nations. It's a much deeper division, which has to do with the fact that the oil industry is split down the middle, with the Anglo-American conglomerates on the one hand. British Petroleum now is integrated into the U.S. oil industry with the merger of British Petroleum and Amoco. And then you have the giant Franco-Belgian conglomerate Total Fina Elf, which is competing for markets in this region, which is also supported by Germany. You have the Russian oil conglomerates. In other words, what we are looking at is a big divide. It's the confrontation between great powers in the areas of oil, but not exclusively. It is also in the military-industrial complex, where you have now an integration of British defense interests with those of the United States. And this explains the relationship between the two governments. It has nothing to do with Tony Blair or George W., okay? It has to do with the fact that British Aerospace Systems is now part of the U.S. defense procurement system, okay? It has exactly the same privileges as the big five, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, and so on. Okay? So essentially we're dealing with the big six. So there's an integration at the level of defense production, there's an integration in the oil industry, there's consultations and integration at the level of the military and the intelligence, with the MI5, MI6 collaborating with their counterparts, and so on. So that is what creates this military coalition. And very crucial, it is also the confrontation between competing monetary systems, namely the confrontation between the almighty US dollar on the one hand and the new global currency, which is the euro. This confrontation for control over currency systems is something which is very important, particularly in this region. The United States wants to ensure that the euro, as a new global currency, dominated by the large German banks, the Deutsche, the West Deutsche Landsbank, the Deutsche Bank, the big French and Italian, handful of European banks, essentially the European Central Bank located in Frankfurt is a project of the German financial establishment. And so that you have a clash in the oil industry, you have a clash in financial institutions. It's very complex. There are lots of overlapping and cross-cutting allegiances. And then you have this split in the defense industry where you have British Aerospace Systems integrated with the big five defense contractors. Incidentally, Canada is part of that through the defense agreements and production sharing arrangements between the two countries. And then you have in Europe what is called the European Air Defense System Corporation, EADES, which is the integration of Aerospatiale Matra, the French conglomerate on the one hand, and Deutsche Aerospace, which is a subsidiary of the powerful Daimler Group. And this has formed a very powerful competing defense conglomerate which does not have access to the US system of procurement, and therefore there's also competition in the production of weaponry. So you have essentially, I mean, these are not all the sectors in which there's conflict between these two economic blocks, but defense industry, oil, and currency systems are the main ones. And this hidden war particularly the hidden war between the United States and France, is something which goes back to the early 90s. It's certainly visible, although it's not reported in the media, in Central Africa, in the Rwandan Civil War, in the Congo, but also in West Africa, and it involves the confrontation of the old colonial powers, particularly France in this case, because Britain is allied with the United States, and the United States, which is establishing itself a colonial empire in Africa, using, again, triggering civil wars through covert operations and so on. All these things have been documented and studied, but they're not well understood and they're not discussed in the newspapers. So that we are dealing with a blueprint for global economic, political domination. This region, as I mentioned, is strategic. Afghanistan has a border with China. Afghanistan is now heavily militarized. Several of the former Soviet republics bordering onto, because it borders onto China, China's western frontier. Similarly, in recent years, there's been a militarization of the South China Sea. The ultimate rogue enemies are China and Russia.